Hello everyone, this week we're going to be talking about Europe. So in this first video lecture I'm going to give a couple introductory statements and then look at the European Union, specifically its formation, how it's run, and some current issues facing it. So to start off, let's look at your student impressions of Europe as a world region. Some things that happen to stand out to me on here are things like history and culture. A lot of the experiences that we have of what is important history has been European history, or what is important art, or what is important culture, and we'll talk about the reasons for that here in a second. This map kind of compares the United States and Europe in terms of size. The population of Europe is larger than the United States, and if you take Europe as the continent as a whole, their wealth and GDP combined is greater than that of the US. So you might ask the question, why is Europe so important? And it tends to be that we think that Europe is quite important because, especially in the United States, a lot of our history and geography was written by Europeans who obviously had a sense of their own self-importance. But we need to put that into perspective, that they might not be as important as we've been led to believe. The term that's used to understand this perceived importance of Europe is this notion of Eurocentrism. This is the idea of looking at the world from a European perspective, and in turn an implied belief in that idea of Europe being the sort of dominant, preeminent culture. So there are definitely particular parts of the region and its history that have had significant impact throughout the world. The history of writing history, writing geography, the texts and maps that we use often came out of Europe, particularly if you're in the American context. And then also processes of naming. If you think about it, there's a lot of places that are named in relation to Europe. So the idea of the Middle East, which is really the southwest corner of Asia. We call it the Middle East because that's how Europeans viewed that part of the world. For Europeans, the southwest corner of Asia was the Middle East, and then the Far East was East Asia, places like China. So those names have stuck and continued in most common use today. Also, they have really increased historic global integration based around European expansion. Refer back to that map of the sort of core regions of the world, where we have US, the European Union, and Japan as these core regions. Now, we talked about imperialism when we talked about the Americas, and we can think about the sort of receiving end of that imperial expansion. So that economic and military domination drew wealth back to Europe, particularly places like Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal as sort of key players in receiving this wealth back. And so that's important to think about in why Europe had the power and money to be as developed as it is today. Another key historical factor is industrialization as really beginning in Europe, and the epicenter is really in the United Kingdom. We can think about this happening in three waves. The key area in this is what's been termed the Golden Triangle. So this is the area between London, Paris, and Berlin as really the major area that this is happening. And if you think about wealth of European countries today, these are the countries that tend to have the most wealth. With industrialization, imperialism took on a new tone rather than these sort of sparse in-grounds that folks had made in various parts of the world. Suddenly, resources were in high demand. So Africa was colonized. A lot of other parts of the world were colonized to try to bring resources into the industrial processes that were happening in Europe. The end of imperialism really came after the World Wars, when Europe was essentially decimated from the battles that had been fought there in terms of human life lost, destruction of infrastructure. And you can see in the images here of Dresden of how how the infrastructure of the city is completely demolished. So after World War II, you have Europe's power somewhat diminished, and the United States and the Soviet Union becoming the two dominant world powers, and at that point engaging each other in a Cold War. We can see that played out on the landscape in Europe, and you see a division here, what was termed the Iron Curtain, between Western Europe that was associated with the United States and Eastern Europe that was associated with the Soviet Union. Well, we can think about the European Union being something that happened earlier, or as an aftermath of World War II. So we're going to talk about how it's formed, how it's functioned, and current challenges facing the European Union today. So the reasons for the European Union to come together: one was the fear of Russia. So you have this global superpower right next door with expanding power into Eastern Europe. And so Western Europe wanted to try to unite to put a stronger face against the Russians. They also had just fought two major wars between France and Germany and wanted to try to find a way to secure a lasting peace between the two. So the idea of integrating the two countries made sense, in the hopes that if their economies were integrated enough, they wouldn't be able to fight. And then also to become a competitive force in the world economy, to compete especially with the United States and Japan. So unification really began in the 1950s with the European coal and steel community, getting rid of tariffs and barriers to trade between the different countries involved. This grew into a European economic community, and this was based on the idea of having four freedoms: freedom of movement of goods, of services, of capital, and of people. So the idea that you could move and trade goods between different countries without having any barriers to trade, things like tariffs and extra taxes that you'd have to pay, movement of money, especially when the common currency was adopted. This really aided and made it a lot quicker and easier to be able to trade capital across the country lines, and then for people to be able to move within the European Union without having to have their papers checked at the borders, with having the right to work in various countries in the EU. So at this point, there's 27 countries that make up the EU, about 450 million people total, and a combined gross domestic product greater than the US. So with this, we have regional interdependence, a common currency, the euro, the coordination of economic policy between different countries, a redistribution of wealth from some of the richer countries to the poorer countries, and then common external policies, so policies for dealing with the rest of the world. But you could argue that this often leads to benefiting the core countries within the European Union at the expense of the periphery. So even though we have the EU as having one of the largest, or having the largest economy in the world as a total unit, there's a lot of internal stratification or uneven development within the EU. Northern Europe, this is the former industrial core, tends to be the area that has the most wealth. And you can see that on this map with the darker green colors having higher GDP per capita. Eastern Europe and the ex-Russian states tend to have much lower GDP. This image just gives an example of a kind of landscape that you might see in Eastern Europe. So on the other side of the Iron Curtain that was kind of put up as these Eastern European countries as a buffer zone between Russia and Western Europe, because with World War II there had been obviously terrible carnage for Russia as well. So they wanted to put some space between them and people that they saw as a potential threat. In Eastern Europe then, you had state socialism as a way that the economy and society was organized, and you had a lot of industrialization that was based on government planning. So they had agglomeration economies where you might choose an area to specialize in one particular thing, and you would have all of the industry that focuses on that within the same area. The idea was that that way you could share labor and you could share resources most efficiently. Within this, you had this notion of trying to create an egalitarian society as well. And then in 1989, you have the collapse of this in these Eastern European countries, then being thrown into a market society and having to reintegrate with the rest of Europe. So with that, you have problems like trying to figure out how to suddenly run an economy that formerly had price and wage controls that were run by the government, to all of a sudden create a financial infrastructure where one hadn't existed before. And then also the privatization of a lot of resources that had formerly been collectively owned by the government. Another form of stratification that you see within Europe is internal stratification. So here you have an example of urban areas and these suburbs. In the city center, you tend to see financial headquarters and affluent populations, where in the suburbs, you tend to see lower income populations and a lack of services and access. The EU gets its funding through customs duties on imports, a value-added tax, and a percentage of the gross national income of member countries as well. So then with this wealth, you have a few different decision-making bodies within the EU. You have the Council of the EU that is made up of the ministers from the different member countries. You have the European Parliament, which is an elected body that represents the citizens, and the number of seats is based on the size of the country. And then the European Commission, which is appointed by member states to uphold the common interest for the EU. The allocation of the EU budget, you can see here, a lot of it is for growth and employment, so this idea of development, preservation and management of natural resources. The common agricultural policy has been a big part of the EU budget, but now there's sort of structural funds that are mainly going to new regions to help ensure economic development and integration into the EU. In this map, what the inflows and outflows within the EU look like. The areas in the warmer colors show an outflow of euros per capita from the people in those countries to the EU. So in the darkest colors, places like Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, you have 5,000 to 1,000 euro per capita to go to the EU. In places that have the cooler colors, you have money coming in from the EU. So the next lighter blue down, 1,000 to 5,000 euro per capita. So you see those former Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe receiving a lot of that incoming wealth, places like Portugal as well, and Greece. So one of the current challenges facing the EU that you probably heard about is the Eurozone crisis. What has happened with this crisis is that a lot of governments within the EU have become very indebted. So to finance economic growth and bail out banks due to the financial crisis that happened worldwide due to the US housing market, governments had borrowed money. But there has been an outsourcing of jobs, so deindustrialization, jobs moving out of Europe as well, and an aging population has left these countries with less income to be able to pay back their debts, particularly Greece, Iceland, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal. This chart shows some of the relationships here between the debt that's owed and who it's owed to. So banks and governments in these 5 shaky economies owe each other many billions of euros converted here to dollars, and have even larger debts to Britain, France, and Germany. So these European countries that are suffering from these big debts are forced to look for financial bailouts, and with those bailouts from the International Monetary Fund come conditions very similar to what we learned about in Latin America with structural adjustment policies. The IMF wants to implement austerity measures for these countries. Now this is a really good example of a supranational organization, which your book talks about. So this is a organization that brings together multiple nation states because of some shared goal. And with any supranational organization, you are going to notice some benefits and then also some burdens from that interaction.